feel that enough has happened at a national level over those 15 years, if we are seeing that theme, or we're seeing progress within those?
There was a program back then where, based on points, just due to having a college degree and having earned, a reasonable salary, I was free to stay here and work and figure things out. I think programs like that are very beneficial.
If I went out and got government to institute a policy that gave every startup founder a gold bar for free, like some of them would be like, I wanted silver. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, right.
It's just that is the nature, I think, of the community. People have idiosyncratic perspectives.
The Unlikely Alliance with Johnson Situ. Bridging differences, sparking conversation.
Thanks so much for joining the Unlikely Alliance podcast. I wanted to start with a conversation about the art of storytelling within entrepreneurship. Don, before we came in, you told me something really interesting about actually how people's impressions of entrepreneurship has grown over the years. It'd be good to talk a little bit about that, but particularly around storytelling. Why do you feel, how has entrepreneurs been able to be really good about their storytelling?
Yeah, so I think I'd be interested in Jeff's take on this, because he's been on this journey as an actual founder. I'm merely a sort of charlatan, but I think one of the big things that's changed is people thought that an entrepreneur or a business person was a person in a suit and tie who came along with a briefcase, and they put the briefcase on the table and they opened it up and they had serious paperwork, and that's what they did. And and actually, if you look at kind of television, you still get a bit of that, like the stories that you see Alan Sugar in a boardroom, and it's all very, like Donald Trump being like, you're fired. And the truth is, actually, like, what's changed is, first of all, that's not what business is. But there's also, I think, as new businesses have been built and people are more familiar with the kind of companies that exist and startups that we would work with, like, if you sort of use Deliveroo or Monzo or things that everyone uses, basically, you'd be like, well, that doesn't feel like a place that will be run by someone like that. Do you know what I mean? Like, and it's like, that's not, and I think that then naturally changes kind of the perception of what business is. I don't know what you've gone on a journey, Jeff. Right?
Yeah, no, look, I mean, one of the things I used to say because I started my career as a corporate lawyer, very much working in kind of the traditional world. And when I left that and went to set up my own business, one of the things I said at the time, which I still think holds, is that, we have seen a more than even generational sort of cataclysmic shift from a world in which value was predominantly created by scale to a world in which value is predominantly created by agility. And obviously that's a gross oversimplification, and ultimately, a lot of the great entrepreneurial businesses have achieved and have made a lot of money out of the scale they've achieved. But if you think about it in terms of what are you trying to optimize for, to build a successful business, in the 20th century, it was lots of factories and lots of people and lots of plant. And the sort of person who thrived in that environment is very different than the 21st century, where the constant advances in technology have meant that your ability to move fast, to react, to try lots of things, to stick with one, to drop others. It's a very different personality type. It's a very different sort of person. It's the world I was very keen to be in. And I think that that's a big part of what we're seeing today in terms of the waves of entrepreneurs who are coming out. They're people who aren't stuffed shirts and a tie or whatever. They're people who just want to move fast and maybe break things, maybe build things, maybe just do things differently than the norm. And that's a big part of what I think makes it so exciting.
And would you say people identify with that a little bit more? And then, because Don, what you kind of illustrated was the fact that actually people's impressions of and you talk about this, Jeff, as well, what people's impression of what an entrepreneur is. And to what degree do we feel media has played a role in that, and popular culture has played a role in that?
I think it's really important. Like, I think that so like one of the big shifts, and I think this is almost what Jeff's referring to, is at some point people generationally you get these shifts, right? As in, ultimately, if you're a younger person and you're wanting to buy a product, and the question is, who do you want to buy it from, right? And I think that you sort of engage with things that look and feel the way you want it to look and feel. That's like a natural consequence and evolution of an environment. And it means that, like, in sort of finding the thing that you want to try and, typically people are like, oh, I want to buy it off someone that I would like, right? I know that sounds really stupid. And that comes down to like, they don't necessarily want to buy it from Mr. Suit and Tie in their big giant glass office, right? And so in almost natural consequence of that, but in terms of the media stuff, I think the big thing here is social media, right? Like, as in, I'm not sure. I actually think I think that the perception of kind of business or the stories they're told about business on television are so detached from like the reality of business, and have been for a long time. I think the media really struggles to tell stories about the kind of innovative businesses that we work with, mostly because, if you look at the business section of a newspaper, it's all about like profit and loss and quarterly reports. And that's not to say those things aren't, there's a big public exchange and there's something very important about that. But like, that's not really like what our businesses think about on a day-to-day basis. And it's not what, if I'm a consumer of products, I'm not there being like, what are their quarterly profits, right? It's like, why do I care? Right. And so I think that actually it's kind of like both the consumer side of engagement on that stuff, and then businesses being able to tell more of their own stories, and founders being able to say more of their own stories via social media. And so now you're seeing, these founders who have huge presences, and actually in many ways they are the brand.
Yeah.
Right? Do you know what I mean? It's like, and you see that whether that's in the sort of UK, and there are people like Grace Beverley, for example, who's done an amazing job of this, like really kind of you're selling herself as much as the people. And then you get versions of celebrities that do the other way around, where they're almost like they use their celebrity to build a brand, which is really interesting. And then, but even just the way people communicate as businesses, I think the really interesting example we think about a lot is if you look at Anduril, which is a defense company that sells weapons at the end of the day, and they communicate as a brand through their founder, who's really kooky, and almost like it's a consumer product. They'll do YouTube videos of rockets, right? It's like, and that's such a different thing to like the way BAE or Babcock would talk about their business, right? It's just such a different thing. And I think that's a genuine evolution.
And I absolutely agree. And part of why a Likely Alliance podcast was set up was actually and storytelling is so important to this. And we've kind of highlighted this in each of the episodes beforehand, is the importance of storytelling and allowing people who may not ordinarily see that career path as one that's suited to them, but identify with the story of the founder or identify with the story of the CEO or somebody who's really important in that piece as well. So we're going to talk and delve into that a little bit more later on in the conversation. But firstly, Dom Hallas, Jeff Lynn, thank you so much for joining the Unlikely Alliance podcast. Dom Hallas, you're the executive director of Startup Coalition, and Jeff Lynn, you're the chair of Startup Coalition, as well as the chair of executive chair of Republic Europe as well. I'm going to talk about, I'm keen to talk a little bit more about Startup Coalition. I'll leave you both to talk about that shortly. But I'm keen to start from the beginning. What inspired the journey to Startup Coalition? Talk us way back when it started. What was the genesis? What was that first conversation?
Yeah, so Jeff, why don't you tell this sort of Startup Coalition?
Yeah,
I can tell the we met story.
No, absolutely. So I had this is going back to 2009, 2010. I had been practicing law, left that, and started working on my own fintech business. And while doing so, I guess early 2010, the great Mike Butcher, who was for many years the editor of TechCrunch Europe, put out a sort of call for people to get together for a meeting to discuss kind of, policy in the startup world. And the particular issue at the time had to do with some copyright issues that, a piece of legislation going through Parliament at the time that would have significantly impacted platforms with, or did significantly impact platforms with user-generated content. So a very, very specific issue. But anyway, a bunch of us got together one day, a bunch of people interested in the startup space, and started talking about, how can we make our voices better known and better heard within Parliament, within government, and on policy issues that matter. And we recognized, and again, this is going back 15 years, so it's a different generation of lawmakers. We recognized that there were a lot of people in power who talked very nicely about the startup world, about entrepreneurship, and then proceeded to legislate in all sorts of ways that undermined it. And I'm not particularly cynical. I do believe that there's a lot of good stuff that happens in government, and that when things go wrong, it's often just because of a lack of understanding, and that information flows and conversation can fix things. Not everything, but something. So in any event, we started talking about that, and I remember after the meeting I reached out to Mike and I said, look, I'm American. I've been here for a few years by that point, but I'm American. Nobody wants to hear my accent, telling British government how to act. So I'm sure you don't want me on the front lines, but I'm a trained lawyer. I understand legislation. I understand some of this stuff. So if there's any help you want sort of behind the scenes, let me know. And Mike, in his sort of inimitable way, wrote me back about 3 words and was just like, great, you're chairman. And that was the beginning of it. And so, we started very slowly, 2010, 2011, to knock on some doors, first in terms of people in government. And we found, to our utter surprise, and this is me, Mike, and some other people who kind of joined the effort, our utter surprise and delight that government, members of parliament, senior civil servants, others, really wanted to hear from us.
Yeah.
They were really keen on understanding our perspective. And as one senior official put it to me, he said, when it comes to startups, we've always faced the Europe question. And he then explained that what he meant by that was a Henry Kissinger aphorism, which said, when I want to speak to Europe, who do I pick up the phone to? And they said, we want to be talking to startups. We want to understand what entrepreneurs need. We just don't really know who to talk to. And if you guys are here to do that, that's fantastic. So we started opening some doors, and then with that came a bit of funding. And by 2011, I did a lot of the sort of day-to-day in that first year, but by 2011, we were in a position to hire our first executive director. And over the following sort of 6 years, we continued on with, one full-time staff member, gradually making our presence known, gradually getting a seat at more and more tables. And then finally, our executive director at the time stepped down in 2017, and I came in to look for our new one, and this guy came across my radar.
And then it all went wrong from
there.
No, and I think so. It was really interesting because I was pretty much the start of I properly started my career. I graduated in 2013, so I was sort of a little bit later on that in your journey. And one of the things that always struck me when I first started working, I was working in consultancy at the time. I'd done a little bit of campaigns work in politics, and this ecosystem of things had started happening, especially in East London near Shoreditch, and you could feel there was like some really cool stuff going on. I had a couple of clients in consultancy that were like from that space, and I used to set up at the events, and there was so much energy. You could feel like there's something happening here that's really good. And I think a lot of people felt that at that time, and that was the moment in time when this sort of ecosystem was really growing. And I always thought, like, how can I get involved in that, And then the job came up. This is a few years later at this point, and I always tell a story because I'd applied for the job before, like the previous time I'd come up, and I got to the final 3 and didn't get it. It wasn't Jeff's fault that time. That was someone
Is that
else.
what Jeff said?
Someone else. Someone else
This is what
was the
Jeff
chair.
said.
So Jeff handed over as the chair.
I had taken a hiatus.
Okay,
and there's a hiatus, and so I blame the other person who's actually a dear friend and is quite senior in government
fantastic,
now, so
yeah. Look,
she's an incredible person, but I always joke about it, and so it came around again, and I was like, okay, like this is the thing. I can really see what we can do with it, and I think a lot of it was, and I'm sure we'll reflect on it a little bit more now. Is like one of the challenges I think was being able to. And as government evolved in the way they thought about the ecosystem, you're getting in the door to start with, and all the work that Jeff and the team had done was that kind of establishing a presence and the respect of government. But one of the huge challenges we saw, and I think technology in general saw it at that time, was like, how do we talk in a way that feels authentic to the community, as opposed to, I always use this as the counterexample. Remember when Mark Zuckerberg had to give evidence in Congress, and he looked like he was like an alien, right?
Yeah.
He looked uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And he was uncomfortable because that's not that
that's
dude's
not-
personality.
that's not
Sure,
what-
that is not what he does every
not what
day,
he usually
and it's
does.
quite
Yeah.
obvious, right?
Yeah,
And he looks
yeah.
awkward and uncomfortable, and
Yeah.
he comes across as awkward.
Even how he presented himself, like he was,
Absolutely, it didn't look right, and and I think one of the challenges was, how do we sort of bring some of the vibe and mood of the ecosystem, which was so vibrant and so exciting, and people building amazing things, into the way in which we engage in the political process, and because I worked in Westminster, and you kind of engage in politics as well, Johnson. It's pretty dry. It's pretty
You're not
dull.
wrong there.
You know what I mean?
You're not wrong there.
And one of the good things about these kind of companies is these guys, we can have fun. It's no, you don't have to take ourselves so seriously.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of it was in addition to obviously all the complicated policy bits that we do a lot of work on, it's how do we make sure that when we do events or when we do, stuff in Parliament, or when we're on the, the calendar of a minister or an MP or, a senior official, that they're like, oh, cool, we're seeing those guys today.
Yeah,
that'll be all right. And it's like, I think that's a big thing.
And I absolutely agree. And actually, just reflecting on Jeff's point, and actually the Kissinger framing is actually a really interesting way to kind of think about this in terms of, you don't naturally think, and we were talking about this earlier, you don't naturally think of, well, previously you might have, but the startup community, the entrepreneurial community is so diverse, so broad in experience. And Dom, you've talked about this as well. I mean, I'm keen to understand, how do you bring those different energies, experience together, particularly when you're trying to speak with one voice to government, where you've got people from different kind of businesses, different experiences, different levels of coolness, if I can dare say. but yeah, how do you bring that all into one space?
It's a really interesting question, and I'm sure Jeff will come in on this as well. But one of the things that I always say is, one of the biggest differences between running, the Startup Coalition and engaging with our community versus running, the CBI or whatever, right, is that if you run a big trade body like the CBI or any of the sort of known brands of politics, like, every day CEOs ring you and be like, what are you doing about X? What are you doing about Y? Here's my public affairs team that's going to come in and talk about this thing. Like, we have the opposite problem, fundamentally, that it's like, a lot of the time, like, the businesses that are going to be impacted by things the government is doing or they want change about, they don't have the capacity to engage, frankly. A lot of the time, things just happen to them and they're like, what, this is happening now? Oh, God. And the third thing is, like, the kind of level of engagement and expertise isn't there because they don't have the resource to engage in expertise. And so the biggest difference, I think, is it ends up with the work being much more kind of solution oriented and much more like, we want to test ideas with you. Will this work for you? Because we think there's a problem here. Is this a problem or is it not a problem? Oh yeah, it turns out it is. Okay, here's our idea for fixing it. Would that help you? As opposed to it being like almost the traditional way in which you can sort of absorb member views and then spit them out at the end. Like, and it's much more like we kind of trying to turn stuff into oven ready policy ideas and things that we can just get done, and actually then kind of bring a coalition along with us a bit more, which is, I think, a bit more entrepreneurial, actually, fundamentally, and kind of treating it as an exercise in like, okay, how do we just like get stuff done, as opposed to worrying about whether we kind of pat everyone on the head. Do you know what I mean? Because the truth is, like, they just want the solution. Like, they don't care how it gets there.
So they're much more solution orientated, and is that? Would you say that as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the decisions we made very early on, which, looking back, actually feels a little bolder than it did at the time. It actually was just a practical solution at the time, was that we weren't going to be a membership-driven trade body. We weren't going to go around and poll everybody and be guided by them. Partially, exactly because, as Dom says, unlike in larger businesses, it's not like the companies we work with have big policy teams that are all over these issues. Often, they don't learn about policies until it's already impacted them. And that's as it should be. These are lean, agile businesses that are trying to move fast, that are trying to build stuff. They don't have necessarily the time to focus. So to some degree, we saw our role as almost an outsourced, role for that. And partially because, frankly, herding entrepreneurs is like herding cats. And we knew that if we built the whole organization around always trying to get consensus on everything, we'd never get anywhere. And so we took the view that as long as we are looking, as long as we have the right intentions, which we obviously do, we're trying to, we're very clear about what we're trying to achieve to make Britain, to continue to make Britain best place to start and scale a tech-led business, that we're there to support businesses, on policy issues that matter to them, then we're going to operate with a degree of independence, actually, and do things the way we think makes most sense, and see the community around us as exactly that, as not our bosses, not a specific membership, but as a community and as people who we can bounce ideas off of, take feedback, always listening, but not necessarily bound to a very strict structure. And that's, I think, it is entrepreneurial, and it's allowed us to move a lot more effectively than other structures might have.
Yeah, and I think the interesting thing on this alliances point as well is it means that you construct different groups of people who are interested in different issues. Right? Fundamentally, like, not every founder cares about every single piece of work that we do, and that's right, right? Because if you're a fintech, you don't care about.
And do you have structures within that recognize it, or how does that work?
No, it's much more ad hoc than that. It's quite organic, and I think the starting point for that, Jeff said, is fundamentally if I went out and got government to institute a policy that gave every startup founder a gold bar for free. Like
Yeah.
some of them be like, I wanted silver. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
It's
right.
you can't- you know, it's just that is the nature, I think, of the community. And people have idiosyncratic perspectives, but the ability to kind of proactively identify issues, build coalitions within the community on those issues of founders, of investors, of the ecosystem folks, and then work out how to address the problem in a way that yes, there might be 20 people who really deeply care about that thing, and there might be 250 people for whom it's like, yeah, that's the thing that would matter to me, but like I'm not gonna spend forever thinking about it, right? Because I'm trying to build my business, I'm trying to do other things, and I think that I've always been really minded that if you meet entrepreneurs who like really deeply care about public policy, they're probably not representative of like the average founder. They're probably a little bit weird, if we're honest, right? And actually, like, I think that sometimes it's healthy to have the perspective that, like, they're probably not like this is not number one, number two, or number three on their list in terms of priorities. Like, this is a thing that needs fixing for sure, and we do our job to do that. But it's not, let's be clear about where it sits in, the ecosystem and what the businesses are doing.
I think that's an important way to look at it as well. And one of the things I know that I found fascinating about your journey, but also about your work, was the work leading up to the last general election and the Startup Manifesto. You had dozens of people and businesses and startups sign up to it as well, from all kinds of sectors and all kinds of experience as well. So firstly, how did you go about doing that? Or did you get this collective to sign up to it? And we there's a couple that I would like to delve into a little bit more, and we'll come on to that in a second. But what were some of the challenges around that as well? So it would be good to start off with, how did you come together with that list in the first place? How was that?
So I think the starting point is we have this standing community that we built over 15 years at this point, and what's sometimes interesting about that is you get founders who build a thing and then they're building another thing, or like they've gone and become an investor now, whatever. Obviously people will evolve, and and ultimately, like, the starting point for us is we know that building a business requires certain things, certain kind of grounding principles. Great talented people, the capital to build a business, and a regulatory environment that allows you roughly to build it, basically whatever you're trying to build. And so all of our work is grounded in those underlying principles. And and at the end of the day, like, what policies then are the best solution available at that moment in time varies based on the politics and the the environment, and like whether we tried that before and it didn't work, or what I mean. But fundamentally, the exercise is, okay, how do we go out and have a bunch of conversations over a number of years, right? This is a permanent discussion about what the right answers are. How do we get them all down on a piece of paper? And then how do we go out and say, what do you think about this? Like, is this a thing you care about? And what was interesting through that process is, obviously there's a bunch of founders, and this is almost what I was mentioning earlier, where there'll be 20 people who really deeply care about a specific, solution to a specific problem on tax or on immigration or whatever. And they'll be like really passionate and in the weeds of exactly how you'll structure that policy. And then, but on the other policy, they'll be like, yeah, no, I trust you guys. You guys have thought about it. But there'll be another 20 people who care deeply about that one, right?
Yeah.
And I think, so that's the exercise in some ways is, how do you like leverage this entire community to support something because they trust our work, because they understand that they're the core issues and they care about. And then we're the policy experts who can turn that into outputs. But then leverage the people who do care about the depth of the outputs to work on the specifics of the detail of like the weedsy policy bits, basically.
And I just wanted to follow up on that. Did those solutions just jump off the page, or did it take a concerted effort in terms of the recommendations that came out of the manifesto?
It's always interesting. I think some of the stuff does, like, and I think that ultimately you're not building with a blank sheet of paper. Right? Fundamentally, you have the policy environment we have a set of rules and laws and structures, and the question is, how do we improve them, not how do we start from scratch. I think that a lot of the time it's therefore like, what is the next phase of the thing, or what is the version more that we wanted to begin with. But in some cases, like, I think you do get to think a little bit more outside the box and some of the stuff, and I think in truth, like, it really depends on the issue and how stuck in the mud it is, or how not it is, or and what the community thinks, right? And ultimately, like, I think that there are some areas where we might have I might think it's really important, and I might have spent far too much of my life thinking about a policy question. And the truth is, actually, founders don't give a shit. And so it's like, there's no point in me spending forever thinking about it if, like, actually it turns out nobody thinks that's important. It's like,
yeah. And Jeff, were you very much involved in some of those discussions as well?
Look, I wasn't super closely involved in this version of the manifesto. We've done manifestos in the past at previous elections, but now with Dom and the amazing team in place, fortunately, I'm
happy to pass that
I'm
on.
I'm spared the work. But what I will say, I mean, just echoing one of Dom's points, is that the broad themes really don't change that much. I mean, over 15 years. We fairly early on centered in on this idea that our three core areas that we were going to look at were access to finance, access to talent, and regulation. And it is amazing how much of what entrepreneurs care about falls under one of those three buckets. And every so often you have some peripheral thing one way or the other that comes in a little differently. But, if we think of those three as being the most important building blocks for a policy regime that supports startups, that you can, get talent, and that talent includes immigration, includes homegrown skills, includes a whole lot. Finance is obvious, regulation covers a lot. So they're broad buckets. But if you are thinking about those three things and thinking about the best solutions within the policy environment you're given, that gets you a long way to delivering the kind of outcomes that we want to deliver. And so it isn't, we're not writing this stuff out of whole cloth or creating it out of whole cloth each time. It very much is evolving off the back of those kinds of core issues that we've been looking at for 15 years.
And I haven't been involved over 15 years.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned that, the themes have been very similar over that 15 years. Do you feel that enough has happened at a national level over those 15 years if we are seeing that theme, or are we seeing progress within those themes?
Well, I think in some ways, yes. In some ways, like with all policy environments, we've had some good policy.
Yeah.
We've had some bad policy.
Yeah.
And then the third category, which is the hardest to see, is the policies that haven't been made. And that's often beneficial too. It's a lot harder to make a thing of this, but or to really publicize this. But sometimes, particularly when you're talking about fundamentally a sort of free market bit of the world and bit of policies, sometimes the best thing government can do is get out of the way, or the best thing they can do is exercise their soft power, come out, speak, promote Britain, promote various things, and then just let entrepreneurs get to it. So look, there's no one particular theme, I think, or one particular direction of travel in all of them. I think we have, by and large, a better policy environment today and a government that understands, and I don't mean this in a partisan sense, I more mean it in a generational sense. We have leaders on both sides of the aisle who understand entrepreneurship and understand tech, a lot better than they did 15 years ago. But I think there have also been some very unfortunate policy decisions along the way, and so it's a mixed picture.
Yeah,
I think one of the interesting things, and it speaks to your question earlier as well about how do these sort of policies come from thin air, is like the questions evolve as the communities evolve, right?
Yeah.
So my favorite stat on this is in 2014, the UK raised probably roughly $4 billion in venture capital for companies, and then we raised $5 billion in May last year in 1 month. And so, if you've seen that level of progress in the ecosystem, suddenly questions that weren't questions before are questions now. So now we're talking about how do we get megatons of capital from pension funds to flow down into venture capital? So how do we think about the listings regime in the UK? And it's we didn't have any companies to list. The truth is actually there's kind of natural evolution to some of these questions and what that means for businesses at a different scale or tech companies on a different journey. And the same thing for our wider work, which is, I would say one of the big shifts is technology moving from a kind of a vertical of the economy, as people think about it, to a horizontal thing. And so for us as an organization, startups now, people are, oh yeah, tech startups, they do tech. Our name used to be called the Coalition for a Digital Economy. And I always joke that the reason why we changed it to the Startup Coalition is because we got a digital economy now. And actually, the truth is the question is you're seeing more of these businesses now being developed, not just in tech in a sort of vertical, and they're just selling some software. They're selling it in the context of our health system, or in financial services, or in energy. And actually, I think the interesting questions that then come out of that are, what does it really mean to think about policy in those areas in a way that encourages innovation, encourages innovative businesses to thrive, and encourages the economic growth that comes from that? And then oftentimes new questions. The truth is you didn't have those businesses being built in the same way 10, 15 years ago. They might have been getting started, but they certainly aren't where they are now. And I think that Like they're the things that sort of keep us breaking new ground in ways that are really exciting and interesting. But really what it's about is there's a particular style of business, that kind of venture-backed, high growth, like technology-enabled and driven business that is taking over more and more parts of the economy, and how do we make sure that we're sort of building rules and stuff to reflect it.
I like the concept of reflecting, and I think it's partly why it's so successful, evolving as the landscape evolves as well. It's probably fair to say one of the areas that has evolved policy context wise is migration. And both the context behind in which we speak about migration, impact on business, impact on the economy, and also impact on the country more widely. I noticed it was one of the key pillars to the Startup Manifesto. And first question, do we feel that we found that balance in terms of how we talk about migration and its importance role within the economy and also particularly within startups?
I mean, look, I think this is an area where we've gone backwards, and I'd be the first to say that I think I was very much in the Remain camp at the time of the Brexit vote. And I think that, one of the great losses there, in Brexit was the loss of this very easy free mobility of young, relatively skilled and educated people from across Europe, who used to just sort of turn up in London, maybe just or not I say London, I mean anywhere in the UK really, but would turn up, might be working non-tech type jobs, but then find their way into a tech business. And the fact that we suddenly went from having, the ease of that to a world in which anybody who was coming into the country, including from Europe, needed to do so under a formal regime, was simply, a loss. And, one may say politically, if one was supportive of Brexit, that it was worth the loss, and that's a decision anybody can take. But I think we lost something there. And then beyond that, I think, even within, the sort of structured migration regimes, the visa regimes and all, I mean, I think, none of this I'm not going to talk at all about, and our world doesn't focus on the sort of, the illegal side, the boats and all that. That's a whole other issue. But skilled legal migration, I think is a good thing for the economy. If you bring in people, who have skills, who have good educations, who want to work, that's going to benefit the economy. I myself came over here originally on a work permit, but then when I knew I wanted to start a business, didn't know what I wanted to do. There was a program back then where, based on points, just due to having a college degree and having earned, a reasonable salary, I was free to stay here and work and figure things out. I think programs like that are very beneficial. And I think that we have been a little bit, as a country, I don't know if it's sclerotic or just undecided, but, we can't seem to come to a unified understanding or acceptance that skilled migration is a good thing and should be encouraged. We've played around the edges a lot. Some things have gotten better than they looked like they were going to get. Startup Coalition, among others, have done a lot of great work in terms of the specifics of the regimes. But I think that one of the things that would best promote an effective and high growth startup ecosystem here would be a much more open-armed embrace of skilled migration of all sorts.
I think that's a really powerful way of both thinking about it in a powerful way of pulling it across. Ultimately, just thinking about it as you've talked about it, in my mind, is you've contributed immensely to the UK. We're just talking about it right now, and the litmus test always is, does the system allow for the next generation of Jeff Lynns to come in and be able to contribute towards the UK? And the question is a big question mark there.
Yeah, and I think, so I come from Leeds, and a lot of most of my family live in West Yorkshire, and I think we have to acknowledge, I just think my family have sort of experienced these huge changes in communities, and a lot of my family live in Batley, and you go to Batley, and the truth is in sort of their lifetimes, the place has materially changed, and it's materially changed in two ways. One, the sort of demographic makeup of the place has changed really significantly. The other is that their economic prospects have got materially worse. And I think that there's a very real reason why this sort of deep sense that this is a problem exists. I think we would all acknowledge that.
Yeah.
I think that in fairness to most people in politics, that's the place that they're starting from.
Yeah.
The question I think then comes down to like, are those two things related? Like, and that's like, and what does that mean? And I think from our perspective in terms of the work we do at the Start Coalition with entrepreneurs and others, it's from, you know, is my cousin who lives in Batley, like, are they being economically disadvantaged because Jeff has moved into the country? Like, categorically not, right? As in, you know, that's obviously the case. And you know, all of the data, like there's some friends of ours on the Entrepreneurs Network do this amazing report every year that shows that about 40% of, you know, unicorn companies, so $1 billion companies built in the tech ecosystem in the UK, founded by foreigners, right? And the truth is actually like that sort of entrepreneurial spirit in our ecosystem absolutely comes from this sort of free-flowing movement of people and ideas. And, you know, I think one of the things that's been really interesting about kind of skilled migration and that move is you go and talk to any politician across the spectrum, from Nigel Farage to Jeremy Corbyn, and the truth is actually they'll all be like, oh no, we're absolutely in favour of these people coming into the country. And if you look at public polling, people are absolutely in favour of those people coming into the country. Like the challenge is sort of twofold. One, what are the policies that then deliver that? Well, so threefold. One of the policies that deliver that. The second is that there's the Home Office and the way in which like the immigration system works is built just to make it painful. Even if they're going to give you a visa, it's just like a horrible experience. And like the bureaucracy itself is like a way in which that has been used for a very long time as a deterrent to coming here, and just like we're just going to make it a big pain in the arse to do it. And I think that materially matters. And then I think that you know, the third thing is, and I say this as I worked as a diplomat in the British government for a while and on the Brexit process, and is that political messages in the UK that are delivered for a domestic audience on, say, migration or other topics that would be kind of red meat or however you want to describe it, it turns out that other people in other countries can read in English. Like, and so when it's delivered in an English newspaper in English language, people will be like, oh, it turns out you don't really want us here. Now, one of the things that I'd observed, having worked on international policy a little bit, is in other countries, those messages still exist. Politicians still deliver those messages, but it's just that people don't read it in French as much or in Hindi or, you know, in different parts of the world, it's told in different languages. That means that like it doesn't come across in the same way from Britain. Like, and I think that, that's sometimes hard, I think, for our overall global narrative on this stuff. In that, you know, people will be like, oh, yeah, I'm not sure you really want us here. It's like, you know, go look at what Emmanuel Macron says about immigration in Le Monde. Like, and it's the truth is like we just don't notice. Like we ain't reading Le Monde. Like, and I think that's a genuine challenge. Like, as well as the actual practical, are we doing the right thing?
Yeah, and I would say there is. I absolutely agree that it's undeniable to say that the impact of, you know, in parts of the UK, areas you've just mentioned, Dom. It's undeniable that people can see that their area has changed, and actually, particularly if you're seeing impacts on your livelihoods as well, because of not as many economic opportunities, that causes a strain, and together with the impact on public services as well, then I'm not going to be too political about this, but then you could definitely see how it impacts on people's view of these things. I think there's also something how you've both done so well in being able to do is telling the story and telling the journey of migrant entrepreneurs and the contribution that they bring to society. And I think it's often talked about, but you know, even the fact, Dom, you've just talked about the impact it has on unicorns and the impact it has on growth as well. And you know, I also saw a stat recently that actually some of the fastest growing startups often have at least one migrant founder, which is absolutely phenomenal in that respect. But I want to take a step back because part of like the Unlikely Alliance podcast is also to talk about our guests, and you've Dom and Jeff worked together quite a bit, and it's fair to say you've got different professional backgrounds. Jeff, you've migrated into the UK. How have you found working together? And You can say anything. It's just between us. No one else is listening. It's just us having a little casual chat.
This is me saying, I gotta say something nice to you. No, but like, so one of the, I genuinely think it's been an amazing experience working with Jeffrey. I couldn't do this job without him. I always say this every time we chat, to be honest. I think in a few different ways. Like the first is, I think, entrepreneurs tend to have like a little bit of an ego, funnily enough. And Jeffrey was one of the most egoless people I have ever met. Like, as in, there is a real tendency, understandably, in any of the work we do, which is so front facing and so kind of motivated and driven, to like the tendency to be like, can I be front and center of this? Would absolutely exist. It would exist for me. As in, and Jeff is like so like willing to like sublimate himself and what he would get out of it for the benefit of the work, which is extraordinary and genuinely amazing. The second thing I always say is like, it always helps me to have perspective in so many different ways, like, because when someone's been on the journey that, I'm building this little organization out and started with just me in a room, and now there's 12 of us and we're doing all this great policy work, and Jeff's been there because he built his own thing. And I remember there was one conversation where I think it'd been a really hard month, but just been a bit rough. A couple of things had gone wrong. And I was like, Jeff, do you ever have these moments where you just like, bloody hell, this has been hard work? And he was like, Dom, I've been building my business for over a decade now. And it's like, it's rarely the case that the month isn't like that.
Something to look forward to.
Yeah. No, and I was like, and I took great comfort in that. I'm not sure that was great for Jeff's mental health, but it was great. It was great for mine. And so I think those two things. And then look, I also Jeff's an incredibly talented person in so many different ways, and he adds an awful lot of like actual genuine skills to our work as well. But and I always find it funny that we get on work together so well, precisely because I think Jeff, you always you're like the sort of relatively blue-blooded like East Coaster, and I'm like a bit rough around the edges. I've always quite enjoyed the double act, so it's been an absolute. And
I love that double act and different approaches to things, and Jeff, now it's just the three of us.
Now
it's a casual chat.
Now you can
actually be.
Let me tell you,
a little bit more scathing.
No, look. I mean, I'll be very honest. I mean, working with Dom has been, one of the great pleasures of my career. We get on very well at a personal level, despite, different nationalities and different ages and everything. It's always a pleasure. But look, beyond that, and to be a bit brass tacks about it, the success that Dom has brought to the organization has made my life as chair an incredibly easy one. I mean, for various reasons, careers evolve in the way they do, and for various reasons, I have spent much of the last almost decade, spending most of my time in a series of non-executive roles, having spent the previous decade, building what was then Cedars and now Republic Europe. And I enjoy it. There are great things about it. There are things that I miss, but whatever it is, the big part of my job as chair or in a non-executive capacity is to try to enable and support the executive team, in doing things, that make the organization successful. And like I said about government, sometimes that's about proactive action. Sometimes it's about getting out of the way. And one of the things I've learned is that's the thing, how the organization is doing, how people are getting on, how, what the outcomes are. That's the thing that matters more than anything. And I can tell you that I have, worked with and been, in the non-executive capacity organizations where I get tons of formal reporting and highly structured, highly detailed updates, and all of them say in various different ways that things are going to shit. And then I have Dom, who gives me absolutely none of that. We catch up over coffee.
Yes.
And I hear about all the stuff that's going well, which is always supported by what I'm hearing externally.
Yeah.
And where there are challenges and things he needs support or wants my views on, he brings them to me straight and we talk about them. And I'll take that any day of the week over.
I can see why you like that. I can see why you like that.
And it's, look, and as I say, I mean, I've worked with people who I like very much personally, but for whom the organization isn't going well. It's a double benefit to get on as well as I do with Dom, and for the professional dynamic to work that well.
See, part of me wants to end this episode there, but I've got a couple of more questions. Dom, did you want to briefly?
I was just going to say, I think the other thing that actually I really learned from Jeff as a manager, and I think it's like something that I think it really reflects on his expertise in sort of doing these non-exec type positions in general, is like, he always said to me, like, you know, if everything's going fine and you just want to update, like, that's great. And if you want my help, like, that's great. But if you want my help, then I'm in it.
Yeah.
I'm in it in properly. And I think that's one of the biggest things that I've learned in my journey here is, like, even with my team, it's like, look, like, what we want to build is a relationship of trust. And sometimes I'll come to Jeff with insane ideas and I'll be like, okay, that's fine. You know, if you think that, that's great. Like, but if I'm like, but I need your help, it's like, okay, now I'm going to be in the detail of this and we're going to make sure we get it right. I'm not going to half-arse it. Like, and then actually the ability to understand that difference of like, no, okay, like, if I'm getting in the weeds of it, then it's my name on it too, and I really care about this. And I think that is actually a really sort of, I think that articulates something really deeply that does really matter to the quality of work that I hadn't thought about previously, but Jeff brings to it. And
that's a really good way of looking at things as well. And because it allows the flexibility and allows, you know, the trust as well, but then also sets the parameters in which you get involved as well. I really like that. So there may be a young person either listening or watching who may be thinking about either setting up a business, may want to be an entrepreneur, who's thinking about an unlikely alliance. He's thinking about doing with someone who may not share the same background or may not share the same experience. What would be your advice to them as they embark on this journey?
Well, look, I mean, first of all, I'm a big believer that, you know, people from different backgrounds, diversity of perspective, diversity of experience, you know, is one of the great hallmarks of success. I mean, every so often, you know, three old Etonians can get together and build something great, but I think that's the exception rather than the rule. I think usually having some form of mixture really adds significantly. And I think where it is unlikely, where it is, people who may, not share some of the same sort of, language or experience, it all comes down to transparency and openness. It all comes down to, finding a good working relationship together, recognizing each other's strengths and weaknesses, being open, and clear about them. I mean, the two great partnerships I've had in my career, one has been with Dom and the other was with my co-founder at Cedars, Carlos Silva. And Dom and I sort of, I think, grew into a lot of it fairly quickly, but Carlos and I, because we had a long startup period before we started, we spent a lot of time, and he was, Portuguese and a techie, and I'm American, and law and business. And we used to spend a lot of time actually talking quite explicitly about, okay, this is more your wheelhouse, this is more mine. I like to work like this. You like to work like that. And I'm not somebody who thinks a lot about sort of strictly defined cultures and ways of working. I do think things need to be organic, but I also think that particularly when you've got people from different backgrounds, different backgrounds, different experience, different whatever, that sort of really super open, this is how I am, this is how you are, there's not one better, one worse, it's just, we're going to recognize and work with those differences. I think that's a key to it. That's
interesting because it's being deliberate. It's something that we've heard in previous episodes as well. Dom?
Yeah, I think that's really right. I'd say two things. I think, first of all, and it gets to your point there, Jeff, like, being really clear about what you're good at and what you're not good at, and then finding people who can fill in the gaps. I think that's the key to any career. Yeah. So I always say, like, ultimately, like, so people think that a career is like filling in all your gaps. I say it's quite the opposite. Actually, it's like understanding how to use your like superpower to be like really, really good at one thing, and then finding the other people who can solve your problem. Because like, actually, how do you kind of work with people who that's their superpower? And I think that really matters. And then the other is like just, there's this great kind of quote, I think it's Patrick Collison from Stripe. It's like, you can just do things. Right? And ultimately, like, if you want to go out and try and build something, or like, it's like nobody is stopping you, actually. Like, for the most part, like, I think one of the big shifts, one of the big changes in, and we started with this conversation about, why people are more interested in founding businesses. It's because the barriers to entry on that stuff are lower than they've ever been. And I think that actually the ability to go out and build something and get feedback on it and be interested in it, and these communities out there that are offering those opportunities and the support the government in many cases is providing for them, like, is more and more available, and that's a great thing. Like, it's a genuinely great thing. And like, one of the nicest things about the startup community in particular is how community driven it actually is, right? Ultimately, like, Jeff, what you always say, you always use the word like cooperation.
Yeah.
And I always think, that ability to be like, sure, you're all building business, so you're sort of competing, but not really, right? Do you know what I mean? In the reality, like Jeff's building his fintech, somebody else is building a climate tech, like, it's not so zero sum. And actually what you get then is this great environment where people actually want to help each other out. And I think that like that really feeds into our work at the Startup Coalition. But if you're out there and you're thinking about building something, it feeds into that too, because like there are a lot of people who want to help you on the journey, and then hopefully you'll achieve what you want to achieve.
Thank you so much. Look, I've found this conversation fascinating. We've been able to explore your Unlikely Alliance. We've explored the startup community and very much the many unlikely alliances that partake in that. We've explored migration and the important role of migration to both startups, but also the important discussion that we're having around migration more widely within the UK. And also we've explored the role Startup Coalition played in the lead up to the manifesto and the election last year. What we haven't explored yet is your musical taste. So the final question is, what would be your go-to karaoke song which would illustrate this unlikely alliance?
Are you karaoke man, Jeff? We've never found ourselves in karaoke, but yeah.
No, we have.
You've got to.
Yeah, being the operative word.
Well, and if after you heard my singing voice, I'm not sure you'd be back for.
Jeff, that's the next question.
Jeff, so what I would say, Jeff is the most kind of English American I've ever met. You can see it. He's got his like gilet on.
Yeah, the gilet. I love it.
He'll be at like Lords at the cricket.
I love it.
And in his tweed jacket. So surely the most English version would be like Sweet Caroline. That is the perfect, and I think that would be great. I think we could definitely smash that.
Yeah, I'll go for that. That's good. There's big enough range there that I can cover my vocal shortcomings, perhaps. So yeah,
brilliant. Thank you, Jeff, Dom. Thank you so much for joining the Unlikely Alliance podcast. I'm so excited to see what the Startup Coalition continues to do in the years to come, and no doubt I will be paying close attention.
Cheers. Thanks very much for having
Thanks so much, Johnson. Cheers.
The Unlikely Alliance with Johnson Situ. Bridging differences, sparking conversation.